Cherry picking is the act of intentionally searching through evidence or data until you find only that evidence or data that supports a particular conclusion, while ignoring the rest of the evidence or data. Cherry picking is sometimes used interchangeably with confirmation bias, which we discuss in another lesson. However, they are strictly speaking distinct. In the case of confirmation bias, our tendency to only pay attention to evidence that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and to ignore evidence that undermines our pre-existing beliefs is often unconscious and unintentional. In the case of cherry picking, on the other hand, it is usually an intentional act of seeking evidence that supports a particular conclusion from among a larger body of evidence. Of course, confirmation bias sometimes causes people to cherry pick, but it's still a distinction worth making. Cherry picking is an act, while confirmation bias is a psychological tendency, often unconscious, to act in a particular way. Let's illustrate cherry picking with a trivial example. Suppose I say that Londoners are fundamentally violent people. I then search through a vast array of newspaper articles, studies, news stories, smartphone videos, and pick out all and only those instances that show people from London being violent. I present this to you as evidence that Londoners are fundamentally violent. The problem here is pretty obvious. It's highly likely that for every story about a violent person from London, there are at least as many stories, and very probably far more stories, about Londoners being peaceful and actively resisting or discouraging violence. I've simply cherry-picked the data points that count as evidence in support of my claim. However, if all the relevant evidence and data were taken into account, very likely my claim would be immediately shown to be false. Cherry-picking is common in political debates. Of course, it may not always be done with bad intentions. Often, and because of confirmation bias, people are simply not exposed to contrary information that is available in the public domain. Their social circles may only feed them cherry-picked information that reinforces certain positions. Nevertheless, this simply underlines the importance of ensuring that we do not allow ourselves to become ensconced in informational bubbles that ensure that we get exposed to only certain kinds of information or certain sources of information. Note that cherry picking is also not the same as anecdotal evidence, although anecdotal evidence can be cherry picked in order to support a particular conclusion. Cherry picking typically involves using a number of different data points or pieces of evidence rather than relying only on one. Nevertheless, those data points or pieces of evidence are only a small subset of all of the relevant information. Cherry picking can thus be thought of as on a continuum with anecdotal evidence. It is perhaps not as egregious as only relying on one person's testimony to establish a generalization, but it's not far off.